To continue last week's discussion surrounding drought, and for our greatest concern currently, hay, this week's conversation surrounds livestock feed and the shortages of a vital sustainment item on a cattle ranch. Welcome to Hashknife Hangouts. I'm Calen. He is my co-host and father, Brandon. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe. And while you're at it, check us out at the social media below: Facebook, Instagram, Rumble, and Twitter. Some days you just can't talk, and today is one of those days, so hang in there with me. A big thank you to some of our returning viewers, but today's topic is going to be hay and hay production in the current 2022 drought. It's August, and we are thinking about winter. The slight catch, though, we've been doing this since April at least. Hay cost last year in 2021, looking through some of our stuff that we produce for our annual ranch meeting, just wave tops here at $200 or 200 tons from Nebraska last year in 2021. We paid $275 per ton with trunking included, thankfully. This again, another 100-ton, so 300 tons total, 100 coming out of Montana at $200 a ton with trucking, came to a grand total of 300-ton worth of hay at $75,000, including most of the delivery costs. So that's $75,000 just in feed for animals and critters to get through a winter. This year, rough estimates for the hay cost of 2022, and they're not on the ranch yet, but it's deals that Dad's been trying to broker privately with people and discuss with them. He's looking at 150 ton of hay at $250 a ton with $8 per loaded mile. So when they're coming back with that hay, you pay them $8 a mile on the way to the ranch. Currently, that equals roughly $32,810. So we'll call it 33. There's a, I don't even know how you said this, Dad. Triticale.
Triticale. It's
okay.
Triticale is a type of, it's a rye wheatgrass hybrid.
Okay, perfect. So Triticale hail. If the nutrients are acceptable.
Triticale hay.
Hey, my bad, not hail. Yeah. See, I told you words are hard. Triticale hay. If the nutrients are acceptable, we'll try and get 150 ton at $220 a ton for that one. So $5 a ton more for this, with again an $8 per loaded mile. That roughly equals 33,560. So 33, 34,000, however you want to call it. But the grand total being $66,370. That's just under about 8 to 9,000 and change less than last year. What's the difference though? We've got less critters too, which is the part that you got to look at the cost benefit analysis of. We've got less animals this year because we liquidated more last year, but we're still paying close to the same cost. Well, what are some of those reasons? There's a lot, and we'll cover those today. Those costs don't account for the hours on the phone and the work to coordinate everything to ensure the animals have feed, because that's still time. That's still things that Dad could be out doing on the ranch, but he's sitting there on the phone trying to broker and talk to people and make sure they happen. Now, there is more hay in Montana this year, and this is coming directly from Dad. I literally took a WhatsApp and summarized it. So there is more hay in Montana this year, thankfully, in 2022, but the fuel and fertilizer costs remain high due to and coupled with overall inflation in the United States. We are counting on the quality being the same at the high cost, but you never know. This year's hay in Townsend is not as good, unfortunately, and the producer recommended that we do not purchase from him. So that's him being honest with us, thankfully, and we really appreciate when people are like that. That's one of the benefits oftentimes in the ag industry. Instead, he felt it was more applicable for a feedlot. So he said, hey, you're just mass producing. You're mostly just filling silage and stuff. This is probably better for that. Don't put it on some of your livestock on the ranch. So keep in mind, we are looking, like I said, about $8,000 to $9,000 difference from last year, but we have a significantly smaller herd. There's costs that are still keeping these overall expenditures higher than they should be due to inflation and fertilizer and petroleum costs and all that stuff. So with that, before we get into some feed value stuff, I wanted to get Dad's take on just overall hay costs, how it's produced, some of the issues we're going through, and the continuation of the drought, like I said, from last week's discussion.
Well, I wish it could be paid for the worry and angst that you go through trying to find some hay.
It'd be a nice little write-off.
it's gut wrenching, when you don't know whether you can feed your animals or not. I mean, that's what keeps you in business. We have a few less animals this year to feed. We culled last year some. We did save a few replacement heifers. The one thing that I didn't really account for with I guess oh yeah, we talk back and forth. Sometimes it's email, not very often, but a WhatsApp app
Yeah.
to text. So I didn't. One of the things I did is we're going to probably hold back 5 to 6 steers, as our direct to sales. So that makes a little difference. That brings those numbers back up a little bit to do, and only because basically there's some profit in that for us. We got to still buy some finished feed for them, which is about that's $400 a ton for that. So, or 390, I guess if I get it in bulk, I got to go get it. There we go. We got some transportation costs again. So, a significant drop, which, I mean, when you're talking 75 versus 60, 66?
Yeah, let me pull it up. It was 75,000 last year, and this
Yeah,
year it's roughly 66,370.
10,000, $10,000 is to me it's significant, but in the overall, that's still a lot of money going out that we hope that we're going to be able to break even on our calves. So right now the feeder market is still strong. It's maybe will get stronger, but we always hope that, we always think that, and then at the last minute, Packers pull their shenanigans and glut the market and hold up on, for whatever reason, they can't slaughter, and so they
Well, and real quick,
control
I'll
the
just
price
throw in
drop.
there. I follow some stuff on email because of like my going through school right now. I've gotten some in some connections into some daily like almost newsletters. This one does graphs for various things, businesses and so on and so forth. One happened to come across yesterday, and we can probably have a longer discussion about that someday soon. But it talked about how chicken is on the rise because beef is on the decline, and pork, and it goes right back
Right.
to the Packers. That's the stuff that's forcing buyers to not buy because of the stuff that you're referencing. It's causing prices to increase, and therefore buyers are like, nah, I'm not going to take it. I'll take the
Right.
chicken because I can still get protein, and it's cheaper.
Well, they have to, because it's costing more to fill their car.
Yeah, exactly. You
I
can't
mean,
blame somebody for trying to take
no,
care of themselves financially. Yeah.
absolutely not. It's all about how your economy is, whether or not you can afford to go out. And if you can't
Yeah.
afford to go out, you sure can't afford to stay in and eat good quality protein in form of beef. One of the things that you look at is, I just do a quick thumbnail calculation about, and part of that is based on, okay, how hard a winter are we going to have? And,
And
I
that's hard
mean,
to do.
it's impossible, really. It's just pure luck when it happens and it works out. Some years we've waited till the 1st of December to have to start feeding cattle because we had plenty of grass.
Yeah.
It was an open winter, they're grazing. And so every day that you're not feeding a cow a bale of hay, hey, that's money not going out the window. But
Right.
by that time, you've got your hay already put in. So it's kind of a relative thing. And if it's good quality hay, you can hold that somewhat a year and feed it last. You feed your poor quality stuff first, and then your better stuff after they've calved or just before calving. And so they got good milkability. But the quality of the hay is really, and I hate to say it, but it's secondary. It's being able to get something in their gut. If you can find, and everybody goes through this, in a perfect world, you're going to want to have really good quality hay, good digestibility. You're going to get some good weight gain off of that, or at least maintenance for the cow during the wintertime, or all your animals. But you're thinking about that second crop, how she's going to look when that calf is on the ground in the spring. But there's some years where there's not a good quality hay, and our Nebraska hay was not great. It was they get a lot of water in that country, and so you would see some spots of mold that were starting to hit, and the cows would pick around it, but it was okay. The hay we got from Montana, fantastic hay, and I'm talking both of these were alfalfa. We normally don't feed alfalfa hay.
Mm.
Um,
Got a little desperate last year.
we got desperate last year, and there's been years that we've had to feed hay that was off of CRP. Those are, and everybody was doing that. They're baling everything. If you can get a swather and a baler on it and put it in a bale and use it, you're going to do that. But you're also going to have to supplement with some kind of a grain. Either you're going to mix that with grains, or as you would in a feedlot, or you're going to feed what we normally do is feed cake along with it, which
Well,
increases your overall cost again because you
people
don't have
maybe
quality.
people may be confused at what CRP is. I forget what the acronym is. What's CRP? The conservation.
It's a conservation reserve program.
There it is. And what it is essentially farmers and ranchers are paid to not use certain parcels of land. And at the end of that, then they can, it's like a contract with the government. And once that contract is complete, then they can use it again like
Well,
they normally would.
not
But
no 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 no.
no,
Those are usually 10-year contracts or such where you can't do anything with it.
well,
Zero.
yeah, well, that's what I meant is like at
But
the
in
end of the 10 years, but I should specify. So you can't use it throughout the contract. If it's a 10-year thing, they can't touch that ground. They can't graze it. They can't use it for
Yeah,
anything.
unless they may have a waiver, and this is where this comes in.
Right.
Some years when the drought, when the government finally recognizes that you have drought, which the government's spot on, right speedy on everything that they do and
Yeah, it normally
recognize.
requires like the governor to declare a state of emergency due to drought, and then that
Right,
allows the federal government to say, okay, let me analyze this and make the decision. So it's not, yeah, it's
right,
not a quick process by any means.
right. And that's done from, like, we're talking Washington.
Yeah.
So, and then they'll allow some of these people who have the CRP contracts to go ahead and hay it or graze it. And, it's best to just get something in a bale so that they can,
Yeah.
sell it later on.
For
It's
that.
very poor quality hay. It's
And that
horrible quality hay.
and that's where I was gonna go with that is the reason why the hay for CRP, while we will take it out of desperation and desperate measures, it's normally poor because you are not managing it. There's parts that maybe
It's
lots of
old.
grass, maybe no
Yeah,
grass. It could have yucca in it because people are just literally just going across and hitting it. They might have sagebrush in there. It's got all sorts of trash that you wouldn't normally put into a bale, but
often weedy stuff. Yeah, the
yeah,
bigger stuff they
weeds.
that'll tear up equipment that you don't do. You'll go around it, but generally that's also ground that's been previously farmed. It's got some grass planted back into it after it's been, had wheat in it or something of that nature. But it creates great habitat for birds, deer, that kind of stuff, and that's, I think, partially why those programs exist. But um, bottom line is it's not great hay, but sometimes when you can't get hay anywhere else, you're willing to take that. So
Yeah.
uh, if you have poor quality hay, the cow's going to only eat so much a day. They're not going to say, oh, this is poor quality, so I need to eat twice as much to maintain. They don't do that. They just fill their gut. And
Yeah.
whether that's good or not, they know it. If you put two bales side by side and one is a good high value feed and the other one is CRP feed, they'll eat that high quality stuff. They can find those carbos, the proteins, the crude proteins, or the sugars that's in the carbohydrates. They know it's there and they're on it, and they will eat that up first. If
Well,
you've ever seen stacks of hay with first cutting or second cutting, second cutting is more palatable.
yeah.
Deer and elk they'll go to those first, or they'll leave the first cutting hay alone and they'll eat that second cutting hay because it's better. Cows do the same thing. They
Well,
just know which tastes better.
it's interesting you say that because I think that's where people are like, "Oh, you can't tell." I'm like, "Yeah, you can. If you've ever been
Yeah,
hungry or something, like your body craves certain things for a
right,
reason." And I think that's the same thing as their bodies can crave that and they feel it and they're like, "Oh, this is what I want better."
right.
And so that's what draws them in.
We're just talking about this as a side note about what your body needs and what it craves.
Mhm.
Lewis and Clark expedition. They
Yep.
were eating fat from the beaver tail.
Mm,
and because it's all fat around
yeah.
that bone, and they were craving that. They put it in a fire till the skin popped or cracked off and peel it off, and they'd eat it. People that have been out at sea, stranded, and they're able to fish, and they get fish, and what do they crave? They crave the fish
Eyeballs.
entrails and
Yeah.
eyeballs and things like
Yeah.
that instead of the meat because their body is craving what it has to have. Cows
The
will do the same
fats and the
thing.
salts. Yeah.
Right, right. So, I mean, your body tells you what it needs and it will go for it. So, your mind has somewhat to do with it. And let's hope that a cow's mind is less sophisticated than ours, our thinking process.
Yeah.
You know, so, they just, they know what they want, they know what they need. So, you're not just looking at the number of days to feed, you're also looking at the quality. You can feed them straw, which has a relatively zero, it's just a
It's a
filler.
filler. Yeah.
And I've worked for people who have fed straw and then fed cake on top of it, the pelleted feeds, where the straw was just a filler, and it wasn't for cows with calves or calvy cows. This is for like yearlings or weanlings, and they were just trying to get them through the winter, give them some good protein source, but they were just filling them up with straw. So it's like eating popcorn with no salt
Yeah.
and butter on it, and trying to give them a little morsel of something else to eat that'll sustain them but fill their belly so they're not hungry.
So this, I think, is the part that brings us to probably one of the more important aspects of the hay, and that's the relative feed value. And I'm sorry, I am a little dyslexic. So if I say RVF instead of the correct version, which is RFV, bear with me.
Yeah,
But we've got
relative
some
feed
stuff here.
value.
Yeah,
Yeah,
relative feed value. And then there's also something that I want to talk about at the end of this little conversation called relative forage quality, which is
right.
RFQ, and that's interesting for us as well. Mom, thankfully, shout out to my lovely mother. She went online for me and she picked out 3 different things that help understand this, and they, relatively speaking, they all kind of say the same thing, just a little bit different and maybe a little better and palatable way, which helps me see the same thing through different eyes and understand it a little better. But she got 3 things out of extension and research agencies, one from SDSU, so South Dakota State University, another one out of K-State, Kansas State University, and those are places we have referenced before. So if anybody wants to, please go check them out. And then another one that kind of threw me and I was kind of surprised was University of Wisconsin, UW. Not really surprising in the sense that Wisconsin's involved with that, but more or less surprising that I guess they were looking at beef cattle, because normally they look at dairy stuff.
Dairy, right.
But they do have some things with beef cattle. I mean, they're talking cattle, so I mean, relatively speaking, you can kind of talk for everybody. It's just depending on how you implement those things. I'll start with the South Dakota one because that seems to be the one that probably applies to us the best. And I have got some notes here, and I'll just kind of go through it. Mostly there's index rate rankings or ratings that they use for the digestibility and the ability for growth and so on and so forth for the animal. So they're talking about digestible dry matter, and then the dry matter intake. So how much of that is actually coming in and how much of it is actually digestible, right?
Right.
And then you take those items, you multiply them together, and you divide them by a specified statistical number to try and keep things relatively on the same line. And the one question I had is, they're given an example of alfalfa, and it's showing the relative feed value of like a 149, and I just didn't know what number they were aiming for. That's something maybe a follow-on conversation is, what's the ideal RFV for something, because I did not see that in any of these. It explained what it was, but it didn't say what the most ideal one is. But if I move on to the next page real quick on the South Dakota State one, it says like alfalfa pre-bud has some of the highest feed value there is, and then some of the stuff that we produce actually has, or the stuff that we prefer actually has some of the less stuff, or less feed value. So alfalfa pre-bud at 164 feed value, and then a lot of our stuff dropping down to below the hundreds, like 91 and 58, and then alfalfa grass mix being a little bit better than that at 101 for the feed value. So again, it comes back to what feed value are we looking for? But to see that our feed value was a little bit lower than what they're suggesting is best, it kind of surprised me. But the thing that I got after going through that was even though the feed value was lower, they finished the conversation in this little research part with the feed value portion before they got into the quality was that and I'll take a quick quote. They said the RFV generally penalizes grasses because of the high fiber fraction compared with alfalfa. The RFQ credits grasses because the grass fiber tends to be more digestible than the
Right.
alfalfa. And so
Right.
that's where we're coming in with, the alfalfa versus the hay. And I kind of wrote a note to the side. There's got to be a balance between the RFV and the RFQ when it comes to digestibility because it's all about what's best for the animal and how they can produce their own body and make sure that they are sustaining themselves.
Okay, then there's quite a bit there to
Yeah,
unpack.
that's why I stopped.
Yeah, the RFV, as I understand that, and these are all again, these are experimental stations, like Fort Keogh in Miles City, where you'll take a herd of cattle and they ration their feed, they measure. That's all where all of this is coming from. There are no units on these values, which
No.
drives me crazy as a science guy, but it's
Well,
because it's relative. That's the whole point. It's
it's
relative
also
to
like our uh I I'm I should know this. When we're looking at our cattle and we're trying to get the
the EPDs.
thank you, the EPDs, they don't have numbers either. Your units either.
Right,
It's all
because it's
subjective
relative.
numbers. Yeah.
Well, and here's the thing with the relative feed value on the measurements is that is based on alfalfa that is in full bloom. When you said
So
pre-bud stage on some of these, that's a different feed.
yeah,
It's a
some of
different
them
quality feed.
and here's what I'll go the alfalfa, the big alfalfa fours. Alfalfa pre-bud 164 RFB, alfalfa bud 152 RFB, alfalfa early bloom 138 RFB, and then alfalfa full bloom at 100.
Right. Because you have to have a standard, right? And when you have like a pre-bloom, okay, what does that mean? And you can see
Yeah.
those numbers, they change uh just before the bloom. That grass, call it a grass, not a grass, it's a legume. The alfalfa is growing and it's got the most sugar content in the cellular structures, and that cellulose and fiber is at its highest sugar content. So you're going to get more bang for your buck out of that, right? But
Right.
it's easier to see what a full bloom is, and because it's a little bit less or subjective on what it is. And so that's your standard. Um,
And I should add in there. I'm missing where my note is, but because I got it right here. It's all in front of me. The other thing that what you're bringing up too is like for example the alfalfa, the full bloom versus pre bloom and where it's at in that stage. There was something in here that I read as well. Cuttings. You can have the
right,
exact same type of grass on the exact same field, same pasture, same year, but the cuttings will be different
right.
RFV because the time of the year. Literally the earlier part of this summer with the way the sun hits and the way photosynthesis works and everything grows with the humidity, and then the same thing 6 weeks later when you're in maybe July, and then maybe if you're really lucky 6 weeks later when you're in like late September and getting that last one or something, that all of that has a big portion into the RFB as well.
Yeah, well, you're right. It's about how many photons are actually hitting those plants. It's temperature, it is humidity,
Mhm.
it is
Soil
the
nutrients.
overall temperature, the early morning to late afternoon temperature differences. Your soil's going to stay the same essentially because they're treating that the same, but your water content, all of that is going to make a difference on your cuttings. And the second cutting is usually lighter than your first cutting because you've had all of that early growth, which
You, you
produces
know where we
more.
messed up?
Wow.
We didn't bring the grass nerd down to this conversation.
I know. Well, he's out on probably on a fire right now, but
Yeah.
yeah, he'd probably geek out on this. I don't know. I'd be good to talk to him about it. So anyway, the comment that it's the same piece of ground, everything is essentially the same, it's the same grasses. Yes, same grasses, but totally different types of growing criteria or environment throughout the season. So your third cutting is very palatable. It's smaller stem, that kind of stuff. So you can't compare third cutting alfalfa to first cutting alfalfa, even if they're all in the same bloom. They're going to have
Right.
different relative feed value. And we keep saying value because the value is based on alfalfa. Now, these were studies that were done in
Yeah.
the 80s, 1980s. So they're already 40 years old, which is great. I mean, so you've got a really good base. 40 years worth of
Well,
stuff on feed value is great.
I'm trying to look at publication times. So because one is '04. So you're saying they had these studies were like in the '80s and they took all the information and then they reassessed it and they published it in the early 2000s.
No, what I'm saying is that these started for the relative feed values. These started in the 1980s and the experiments. Uh,
Oh, okay.
all right. And then they realized that, grasses are different than legumes.
Oh, yeah.
And so,
How so here's the other question. How did they not know that?
they did know that, but what are they feeding dairy cattle? See, these again, you're
Oh,
talking about
yeah.
Wisconsin, right?
Yeah.
And if you'll notice on most of these studies that I've seen, um, most of the comparisons are done with cows, cow calf, dairy cows, heifers. They're all gender specific because I think they're
Hmm.
comparing dairy cattle, which what do
Well,
you do with a dairy steer?
but you go broke, right?
You go broke, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So exactly. So everything is compared with a gender because they do feed different.
Well,
And
and
so
I
there
think
again is your another standard.
well, why do they feed different? I mean, that's a
It's
natural
gender.
question. Yeah, it's hormones is what it is.
Right.
It's
Right.
hormones and age. You're gonna have your most muscle growth for especially like young women humans. It's gonna be in probably the teens, early 20s, and then most muscle growth for men is gonna be late 20s, early 30s.
Right.
It's just it's hormones and it's body types that
Well,
are
that's why it's easier to get fat on a heifer for feeding out than it is to get on a steer.
right.
I mean, it's the same thing. It's hormonal. It's fat deposition. Where does it go? Uh, so most of these have to be extrapolated for your steers or other gender on especially your feeder cattle and probably your stocker cattle that you're gonna take for slaughter purposes, which is
Right.
mainly steers. So
Well,
anyway,
and
they
I'm looking at the RFVs real quick for the three that we've talked about. It's alfalfas, and then the brome, or essentially you think grass,
right.
and then silage and sorghum silage. So corn and sorghum silages.
Yeah.
Uh, those are really the three blocks in the small table that was provided by K State, and the relative feed value is higher for the silage and for the alfalfas, but and this is a big but the digestibility, the NDF, is significantly. I mean, I'm not talking like, oh, it's like 5 points. No, I'm talking like in the relative feed value here. The closest is 10 points, 9 points, I guess, between grass and alfalfa for digestibility. And at most, there's a 50-point margin between alfalfa and brome in the digestibility. So that's very like that's clearly significant. You don't need
Which,
a statistics
which is
person.
higher?
The grass. Sorry, the
Yeah.
grass is significantly
Yeah.
higher in the digestibility. Yes.
Well, and with your relative feed value does not measure protein.
No, it
So
does.
that's part of that. So there's one of your, and it's not a flaw. It's just something that's missing there that they didn't measure that. It's
And
not measurable.
they recognize that in one of
Yes.
these,
Yes.
and they said essentially you have to look at it as a supplement, which I was like, I don't
Right.
know if I can really agree with that. I don't necessarily disagree with it, but I don't completely agree with that either. Like protein shouldn't be a supplement to a feed.
Right. But
Um,
but
yeah,
what they've done is they want you to understand, I think, that it's not measured, but it is something that is there and is going to contribute like a supplement is, but you're just simply not measuring it in the relative feed value. So that
Yeah.
was recognized. That was recognized that legumes and grasses, uh, they behave differently in a bovine system. So then, and this is really just a natural evolution of or extrapolation of, okay, we've done this with dairy cattle. We've got a lot of data, and hey, this works. But there's a lot of feedlots out there that could use the same information.
Yes.
And whoa, wait a minute, there's a lot of grass producers that could use the same information. So how do we do that? And they recognized that um, the non-digestible cellular structure in alfalfa is a whole lot different than in grasses. The grasses, it is much more digestible for one, and
And why is that?
just the cellular structure. The older a plant gets, the thicker, heavier that
Right.
the cell wall gets, so it's not as digestible as
Well,
easily. So it
and that's
passes
the
through.
that's the one thing that people, if they handle hay feed at all, they'll realize alfalfa is so much more thick with stem and so
Right,
much more stem-y.
right,
So yeah.
right. In late stages. So the more you get out of that,
Mm-hmm.
now there is some benefit to that. You want some growth there because if you have nothing but super high, call it what is it? The max is 200 RFV, I think.
No, I thought it was 180. No, you're
Yeah,
right.
that's
This is saying 200, but all the stuff that I
yeah,
was looking at was 180. But yeah, the quick table, it says 100 to 200, like heifer or a dry cow, a heifer being 18 to 24 months, 115 to 130, a heifer 12 to 18 months,
yeah,
and a beef cow and calf. So they're saying, a cow and calf pair should be 115 to 130. And then the only thing that there's other stuff too, but the other one we would care about for beef would be 3 to 12 month stalker cattle, which is kind of what we've got, and
yeah,
that would be 125 to 150 for relative feed value.
right.
But yeah, 200 it does appear to be the max.
Now, here's the problem with that. The higher the relative feed value, the faster it passes through the system too. So you're not going to utilize as much, or the potential that you're not going to utilize as much. So um, you get
That makes
passed through.
sense because if it's not digestible, it's not being used up and actually digested. It's just passing through.
Well, except that your feed value is high. You're not spending any time in the rumen. It's just
Yeah.
being shoved right on through. So that you get to a higher end there where you're losing some benefit, as I understand. Now,
Well, and that's an interesting thing to let me mark that real quick. That's an interesting thing to think about too, right? Because you can have high value. I'm trying to think of a good analogy here. You can have high value and low digestibility. So what's really the benefit? Because if it's high value but you're not actually digesting it and it's just running through your system,
you're not squeezing everything out of that sponge.
right? And so that's where I'm thinking like, well, that's interesting. Would I rather have high feed value and low digestibility, or low digestibility and higher, or low feed value and higher digestibility, which is what we tend to go towards? And to me, that actually makes more sense because I'm willing to take the feed value portion and take a small hit on that as long as it's more digestible and more acceptable through the body.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, there's a balance there. I think you want good digestibility because they got to be able to scrub that gut and keep it moving. That's the whole point of having, some forage in there, some
yeah,
stem, and those grasses. That's what they're designed to do. Here's You got to look at it from another point, and that is, what would they do if there were no feed that was supplemented? They'd be eating grass, right?
right,
So that's where maybe your quality is still, your digestibility needs to be up there. You need to have that being able to be digested and utilized, but keep it slowed through the body so you get everything out. It's about residence time in the gut and how much nutrients you're pulling out of that for your body. So um, you put the best stuff in the world, but if it squirts through fast, you're losing some on the other end, literally. So having a little bit better digestibility and residence time in the gut is better. Even if the quality isn't quite as good, you may get as much nutrient out of that as you would as something that's going through fast. Just kind of a side note there. So
yeah,
that's why you'll notice they're not all saying, well, you want 200
right.
RFV. you want something backed off from that, because based on whatever that body system is doing, at what stage of growth are they mature? Are they growing to maturity? Are they supporting an animal that's trying to become mature? So there's all those different reasonings there, which is great why they did, taking all of those studies and putting them together for what is the most beneficial, or the range of beneficial use out of whatever you're buying. Now, you had what, 20 years, I think, in the 80s to, I think you said 2002, 2004, studies were starting to be done with grasses, which is an entirely different species, where you're looking at something that has higher digestibility, and it's got a lower, was it lignin content, which helps with being able to be digested, than you have in alfalfa.
Yeah, and that's a big word for me because I'm just a simpleton. But the part here that I saw from Wisconsin is that, leading to your point, RFQ, so forage quality, is a better estimate to grassy samples than
Right.
feed value. And I completely understand why, because what is forage? It's going out and picking
Eating.
things
Yep.
freely
Right.
versus it being shoved in your face. And so I can see where, okay, the forage quality is much better for grasses, because in that particular circumstance you are looking at, okay, how much per maybe square foot. I don't know what we'd have to ask Braden, square foot, maybe acre, whatever it is, how much, what the density of the forage and the quality of the forage is much better to understand versus the feed value, because in that particular circumstance the animals are let loose and they're there to choose at their free will.
Well, honestly, I don't think that has anything to do with what their study was. I think because this is all about quality of feed, and I think they're using feed and forage as a same term, different word, but the same meaning, because of a study. Because it's we even talking about this, we talk about relative feed value. I'll say that your relative feed value, meaning relative forage quality. You say them interchangeably, and I think that happens all the time. And I think that was probably done because when a cow feeds, what are they doing? They're eating.
Yeah.
When a cow forages, what are they doing? They're eating. So I think those were probably used for study. You know, just my
Yeah. And then,
supposition, because what they're still doing is they're basing this off of feed that is controlled and fed to them. Otherwise, you can't. How you gonna measure that with that? Your dry matter intake versus non-digestible fiber. So it's still being fed to them and measured with quality of hay, but it's the quantity that they're given. They're not just allowed to forage, I'm sure, on their own. It's all about, it's just different terms meaning the same thing, because they're measuring, the non-digestible matter and digestible matter, and they're taking into account the type of cellular material that cow is consuming. You don't do that when you forage. These are all fed animals. These are all measured, and then they're weighed. I mean, these are very scientific
yeah,
in
well,
their
and then
manner. They have to be.
Wisconsin's Wisconsin. I'm going back through this article real quick as you're talking about it, and they're saying that they introduced RFQ as an improvement to feed
Correct.
value in 2002.
Okay.
That's when they
2002. All
introduced
right.
that. Um,
Because they knew there was lacking in the relative feed value with the alfalfa, because there's other grasses. There's alfalfa
right.
grass mixes.
And they said it's based on the same concept.
Right.
And I'm trying to, let me see if this one's got the, okay. Where's my, all right. So here's the RFV. I'm trying to look at the equations real quick. Just off the top of my head, looking at this, they're still talking intake, but they're basing the quality, the forage quality versus the feed value. They're taking, instead of digestible dry matter, they're taking intake over
Right.
body weight for quality.
Right. Right.
And then for dry matter intake, I don't even TD. Oh, it's like okay. Then they took another equation and digest or divided that by dry matter. So
Okay.
they're using more dry matter in the RFQ sense, and that makes sense as to why it might be more
Well,
valuable.
and here is the difference. In an RFV, relative feed value, that's all laboratory based.
Mm,
That's not real life based where they're measuring weights of the animals. Where your
yeah.
relative forage quality is based on intake and weight of the animal and how they've actually utilized that. That's the one flaw with the relative feed value. That's laboratory based.
Relative feed value is based off of a nothing other than the feed versus you're saying RFQ is the feed plus what it does to the animal.
Right. Now,
Mm,
but what they've done is they broke that down. That's how they got the standard off your alfalfa as 200, and there's no units. It's just relative. That was all done in laboratory, and now they applied that to the cattle
yeah.
as a feed.
It's
Where
analysis. That's
it's a
post
now
hoc
yes,
analysis. Yeah.
yes, and then with the forage quality, they actually did that with the animals. They basically had the RFV was done for them, the feed value, so they can now apply that with grasses, and then but it's still relative to a full bloom alfalfa from the RFV, but the relative feed quality of the grass now takes into account how it affects the animal and the digestibility, and I believe it also takes in protein as part of the equation.
Yeah. To me, it sounds like they went on the football field with the plays at hand and
Yes,
with the RFV,
right.
and then they actually applied them in the game with
Yeah,
RFQ, and they saw
that's
the outcome of it.
I think that's exactly right. So
Okay, that makes
still
more sense then.
important. It's still important. The relative feed value is still an important number. I mean, that's the basis for it. But if you really want to get to what's the most beneficial for your animal, you're going to start looking at your forage quality,
Right. And that,
right?
I think that's a great place to kind of go to another segment is like, well, okay, great. You've taken all the information that was given to you, and now you're doing what any normal business or normal industry would do, and you're applying the lessons to that, and you're going to try and improve your stature, your status, what your wherever you're at to make sure that you get better. And that is why over the last 20 to 30 years, we have continued to increase the efficiency and the production within the
Part of it.
beef industry.
That's part of it. Absolutely. You are taking the best feeds and trying to customize your feeds to get the most out of them for your animals. So that's why you can get the better gain, the faster gain, um, and put those towards a practical and, in your business terms, what's the most efficient way to do this?
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That's what it's about. No, that's how you stay in business, right? Do
Well,
more with less.
and I'll echo again something that I heard recently was we still produce roughly a third of the world's beef with roughly 12 to 15% of all the
Right.
cattle in the world. I
Right.
mean, you can't do that without learning lessons like this and being
Right.
able to apply it appropriately and make sure it works,
Yeah. Well, and thank God for our uh, experiment stations that
Mm-hmm.
do the research. I mean,
And more
these are
importantly, not even just the research, but recording it. If we don't
yeah,
record
oh,
it, it's
absolutely.
useless. If we don't
Well,
have these numbers over time, then we might as well just throw it in the trash can and not even try it.
right. Well, and there's that is an important point, because what's the point of doing it if you're not going to use it, or you're not going to continue to build on that,
Or share.
um, or share? Yeah, that's an important thing, and I'm very thankful for those experiment stations, and I never really thought they were that important as a kid,
Yeah.
but then as you realize, later on, what they're really producing, and a lot of these they're a slow churn. This isn't something they do in 6 months.
Mm-mm.
I mean, these are a
6 years,
number of
maybe.
years for repeatability. Yeah,
Yeah.
6 years. You might have a 10-year study.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on some things, I'm sure they're doing some things out there that are like, holy cow, that is, pardon the pun, holy cow, but are
Well, what's more
are really
important though,
earth shaking.
you're I mean, you're talking a 10-year study is, relatively speaking, it's a very short study,
It's a short
because
study.
the stuff that we want to know are the cycles, and looking at 50, 75, 100-year studies. Where
Yeah,
were we in 1922 compared to now in 2022? And what were the cycles from that
right,
point to this point? And how were the ways they reacted? And what were the best ways they reacted? What were the worst ways they reacted?
yeah.
What are the better ways to apply certain concepts and understandings versus what are some of the worst ways to do that? Those are the things that I find useful, because then over time we can say, oh, they had a similar weather circumstance or seasonal circumstance
Right.
like we do now. We can apply the lessons learned and do it appropriately.
Well, and you also need to think of it in this way. One of the most important things for a good experiment to be valid is it has to have repeatability,
Mhm.
right? For the validity of it. Uh, a lot of these experiment stations, I don't know how some of them work, especially in the dairy industry. They probably have very good a number of samples, meaning how many cattle do they do? If you've got some captive um, dairy farms that are more than happy to let you help them feed their animals, measure that, that's just good business. There may be some warts in there where you got some timing, and the amount of labor to do that is going to be prohibitive unless you have that help. So that may be done well. Out west here, with some of the experiment stations that are done on just beef cattle, they may have a limited number. They may only have 100 head sample. That's not a very big sample. So in order to do a really good experiment, they may have to have that repeatable, or maybe they're doing all 300. Maybe it gets a good amount of area where they've got 300 head that they're running. In 10 years, that's only 3,000. That's a 3,000 head study. But how repeatable and how close of results do you have over those 10 years? Then that you could have more validity to that. If they're wildly varying in those 300 head of cattle each year for 10 years, you may not have that great a study. But I think they've got these nailed down pretty close.
The
And I don't
the
know the numbers. I'm saying 10 years. I don't know what those study links are. I'm just putting that out there as a you know example of what it would take possibly.
I think there's a cost and a benefit to that, because
Oh, there is.
if you do 10 years and you do 300 head at a whack, like that's fine, because you can probably clamp down on the quality of care and the observations of that select group much better than you would if you were to do 1,000 at a time and you get 30,000, or you get 10,000 versus
Right.
3,000, right? That's a benefit. But then again, like you said, you're also not getting the repeatability in terms of bigger numbers. Like, what does this do and what does that do? The other benefit, I think, to having smaller numbers is you could potentially have multiple herds in terms of what do
Comparisons. Right.
Highland cattle produce, and how do they look compared to Red Angus, compared to Herefords, maybe
Right.
even compared to Black Angus. I would
Right.
probably just say black and red are interchangeable, but you could even see just, hey, what is maybe even the difference between those two? So you have
Right.
a two, three, possibly four. Because realistically, why would you have a Highland herd in Montana? That's weird. Other than to produce them for like individual customers to purchase,
Yeah.
because Highland are they are used for beef production, but Montana, they're so hairy and everything. I could only imagine the stress they are in the summertime. That's
You know,
my thought.
I wouldn't worry much about Highland cattle in the January calving.
No.
They're built for it.
No,
Unless you got one.
give me a Christmas calf, baby.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, hey, I am completely fine sleeping and not checking these heifers.
They'll be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, but
But the
the
summer you'd be stressing. You'd be trying to make sure they got plenty of water, they got some
shade.
shade,
Yeah,
maybe even go out there and buzz them.
yeah. Right. Well, but I think that you also, with your experiments on this and your comparisons, yes, you're going to have different results on different comparisons on body systems. You also, if when you're running, if I'm running an experiment, you could say, okay, every experiment station west of the Mississippi this year is going to do a study on RF, RFQ, relative feed quality, based on your animals. The problem with that is now you've built in variability. If you do every station, they're in different places. Your environmental type of
That's fine with me.
aspect is no, but then you've built in variability, which you cannot measure necessarily. It's not measurable because of that.
But if you did that and you did it over a 10, 20, 30-year span, you could see what the regions and the areas
You
did
could.
over that.
You could, if that's if that is the focus of your study. But if it's
Right.
not the focus of your study, you're building a variety of different types of items that are not controllable, but not necessarily attributable as
Right.
well.
Because let's look at west of the Mississippi, because the West is far more diverse than the East. You got Northwest Washington, and you've got South, bottom of the tip, Texas,
right?
and then you got over in you're gonna have Minnesota, northeast Minnesota off lakes, all the way back down to, let's say, Los Angeles,
Right.
California, and then everywhere in between you got the Tetons. You've got
Every ecosystem is there.
oh, sweet baby Jesus, like
Yeah.
it's not even close. Like
Right.
that's my point. And then to the right of the Mississippi on the east, you've got mostly forests, grasslands, farmlands.
Right.
You've got some swamps and stuff like that, but it's much more similar
Right.
by far.
So you could take that, you could do something else, and once you've gotten your basis for that, now you can do that experiment on what is your areas, but your forages are going to be different. You
Yeah.
have to feed the same feeds in all of those areas, and because that is now what one of your standards is your feed, which it should be anyway. But now you're measuring environment, so you got to be very careful about how you do these. And I'm you know I'm pretty comfortable. I'm very comfortable with some of the methodology that these schools are doing with these experiments and in these ag stations. I mean, they do great work. And why would they do shoddy or substandard and it's essentially it's lab work for the credibility is at stake, and an entire industry performance is at stake. And I think your point to 34%, 35% of the world's beef production done by 10% of the area or speaks for itself.
Yeah. Well,
We've taken those lessons and we're applying them.
right. The other thing too is, for those who are anti-beef, thinking along the environmental aspect, I can't think of reasons why not to support extension agencies and stations, because this is a better way of understanding not only the environment as a whole, but also what are some of the better ways to approach it and take care of it while also producing at the same time. So if anybody ever, I don't know if it's really ever come under the hammer in terms of trying to take out these things financially in terms of congressional funding and stuff like that, but if they did, that's where I would think that representatives would stand up on both sides of the aisle and be like, no, we need to keep them because they're important.
Well, and they're sometimes comes results from these that are not what we want to hear.
Oh
And
yeah, for sure.
when that happens, let's adjust. Let's make it better. That's the whole
Yeah,
point.
yeah,
So we want to know what works and what doesn't, so we don't do the things that doesn't help us.
yeah.
I mean,
Well,
it's ludicrous to not pay attention to those things.
we missed the mark on that one. Okay, I guess we'll try and fix it.
Well, okay, what do we learn by that?
Yeah,
What can we do to adjust to make it better? I mean, sometimes the a failed experiment, what you think, what your hypothesis says, and it doesn't work, will benefit you phenomenally because it didn't
yeah,
work. I mean,
yeah, that's a good point.
that's keeping an open mind and applying what you know. Now try to take that, change your hypothesis, or you have an entirely different experiment that you need to now chase and see how it does, and if you can repeat it, and what you learn from that, and how that applies or contrasts with your original experiment. May not be related, but you may learn some things out of that so many times I've asked a question that all of a sudden I get an answer from it. There's something I don't know, and now I've got 6 different questions
Oh
based
yeah.
on the answer I got from that. I mean, that's just learning
Yeah.
and application of lessons. So um, all comes back to you're trying to get the best feed quality. I look at feed quality, not feed value. I want that
Yeah.
forage, and I say feed and forage interchangeably. And sometimes when I say relative feed value, I mean quality. So, when I say feed value versus feed quality, I really am meaning feed quality because
Well,
we
and that's
tend
what
to feed our
Wisconsin said anyway, was it's kind of
right.
interchangeable. So
It's interchangeable. It is interchangeable, but there are different measurements. But we tend to feed our cattle at either rate. We want it to hit a range of feed quality in there that, because we're running a little bit of everything. I
right.
like to have some of that 120 to 150 feed quality if it's measured. Now,
Yeah.
you mentioned way early when we were talking about the different types of hay. I got some good grass hay that we normally get from this producer every year. Last year, he barely had enough to cover himself, so we couldn't get any of his hay. I got half of our hay in that type, and then he said, "Hey, what about have you tried Triticale?" And we have not tried the Triticale. There are some
No.
inherent dangers in
Keep
that, and I
talking.
think we need to talk about that, and that is um, the number one thing to look at is the nitrate levels in it. What is in this feed that can harm? And nitrates are something that's gonna kill your cattle or have the potential to kill your cattle. So you want those nitrates to be in acceptable levels, and then I want to know what that feed quality is going to be. And if those nitrates are low enough, if we're not worried about it, it's not going to be an issue. Then yeah, I'll take that hay. I'll try to work with that producer to maintain my source, and I try to do a number of sources so that you can try to get hay from them every year. Uh, but like last year, if they don't have the hay, they can't sell you something they don't have. Or if they do, you're a fool for buying a bridge, somewhere. I mean, you just can't do that. So, um, having that uh, ability for us to look at that different feed and keep an open mind, say, well, maybe this will do it because I don't know much about feeding triticale and how it is, and I trust him. I trust this producer, and he tells me what they've experienced with it and why they are making it. So, it used to be years ago we didn't feed any hay in the wintertime, and we paid for it in the late 1800s. And so we decided, you know what, we got to start feeding these cattle in the wintertime or they're not going to make it. And that again is part of our efficiency increase, our weights. I think that's from over 100 years ago. And then they tried different
Yeah.
feeds, lots of different stuff. Sandfoin was a big improvement, which is kind of you can think of it as a precursor to alfalfa. It's not the producer that alfalfa is, but it's similar to it. And so, but do you ever hear anybody producing much sandfoin anymore? Yeah, they've
I've
moved on
never
to
heard
something
of it,
better. Yeah, okay,
but
but
I
but it's
mean,
something that's it's something because we don't use it seldom, and there's probably somebody out there that's got something in their mix like that. But you generally hear when people think of hay, I think they think of alfalfa because you got
yeah.
high yield for the producer. It's a standard feed. It's a good feed for good dairy quality, high protein. 26% protein in alfalfa is great dairy quality hay, and so you're wanting to get a lot of nutrients for that cow to milk and produce. Um,
Well, and
so so
let's
chur-
start there real quick. We we normally use alfalfa, and we're okay with using alfalfa, is what I should say. Preferred alfalfa grass mix.
prefer
Now,
grass.
prefer grass
Yeah,
overall, but yeah,
yeah.
but when it comes to the cattle, like we're much more loose about what they eat and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Why is it? Because I know somebody's gonna ask. Because there's a lot of people in the horse world. We do horses and cows. A lot of people in the horse world say I only do alfalfa. Why is it that we prefer to do straight grass with horses versus feeding them the hay alfalfa mix or anything like that?
Well, I will take a little bit of alfalfa in a grass mix for horses if I have to. They just do better on grass. They if you watch when they're pooping, nice clumpy horse turds. With high protein alfalfa, you got a couple of issues there. Now you're feeding a horse high protein. What is high protein? High energy.
Yeah.
And if you got people that are wondering why their horse bucks them off in the spring after they've for no apparent reason, this is why. And it also makes them washy. When you watch them, I mean, they're pooping like a cow does.
Well,
They need to
and
have
what
that.
if what's the RFV on that for horses? You know, because horses aren't freaking they're not efficient with what they eat anyway. Because what comes in pretty much is all that comes right back out. You know, a
Right.
little bit later, and so I would imagine the the quality or the feed value in that, if it's washy like that, is probably far less than it would be just regular grass if that's the case.
Well, again, and they're pushing it out fast, right?
Yeah.
They also they're not quite like a cow, or they need forage and stem, but they still do. They still have to have, because they have fermentation going on a little bit in their gut and the hind gut, but they still need to have protein, but not in the high levels for the production. You know, they're in horses should be in maintenance, not in production of weight, or necessarily, with the exception of a mare with a colt, into milk
Uh-huh.
production. And they get what they need at a way lower protein intake. Don't whole different use. We're not feeding horses for slaughter. We're not in Canada or the French
Yeah, I was
necessarily.
not in this
So
country.
right. But it's just a different body system too, and how they react. How many cows are people riding? Not many. They'll still buck, but we're not riding them consistently,
Yeah.
and that's not their purpose. So we're looking at behavioral issues and behavioral changes in horses versus cows too. So um, a solid stem grass, or solid type stem grass, is way better for a horse than the alfalfa is. Now people say, I only feed my horses alfalfa. That's okay, but
Yeah. Now we're talking
they're not
preference.
feeding them a lot of times. They're feeding them an alfalfa, and I've heard friends of mine say, geez, I mean, snow is falling on out there, and the steam is coming off of my horse's back, and they're, as they're feeding them a leaf of alfalfa, or out of a bale. Like, that's why. You got a high protein, a high metabolism, and they're pushing that through. And then they're wondering why these horses kind of act up and are bucking and that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
just, again, open up a whole different argument here. And there's going to be people hating on this because, I'm not bashing hay. I just think it can be, or alfalfa hay for horses. I think you got better choices. And
Well, and I think it's all about what you're trying to get. I don't know. Maybe you want more energy, and maybe it should be in a racing horse or something of that nature. But
right,
I mean, it's all. I think it goes back to preference and what you're looking to get out of
right,
what you're trying to buy.
right.
Really, I mean, if they want to hate on that, then they can do all they want. I don't care.
Yeah. Well, but the point is, I'm really strict about getting grass hays for our horses, and then being, as you say, a little bit more variable with our cattle, getting what we can get, but I still want good quality hay.
Mhm.
And trying different things. We'll try this triticale, but I really got to watch these nitrates. I mean, why stick something in a cow's mouth if they're going to make them sick or kill them? That's
Right.
stupid,
Or
you
lose
know,
calf.
or lose calf. I mean, there's just, but I'll try this and see how it does. And last year we had poor quality on the Nebraska hay. Wasn't as great. This hay from locally here was good quality alfalfa hay, and those cows showed it. I fed the poor quality hay first, and then finished up with this better quality hay when these cows were late stage of calving, and had calves on them, and were milking, and um, this was good hay. And that's why I went back to him again this year to try. But the man is honest, and he says, hey, this hay's been wet. It's not got the quality it is. He said, I'm going to sell it to feedlots so that they can grind it with some grains and make better hay out of it, better than it is to just go ahead and feed out.
And
I appreciate that.
to add on to that, you know, it's not like the Triticale is unproven, so to speak,
No,
because the guy that we're getting it from has his own cattle. So
right,
I guarantee he uses it on his own cattle.
right,
So it's not like it's something we're like, well, we don't know if it's going to work. We're going to hope it works. It's just, it's something that our cows just may not be familiar with, and their gut may not be as familiar with it. And so we got to see what it does. And maybe the way he produces cows is not necessarily the same way we like to, and it's just not going to be as beneficial to us, or maybe it will be more beneficial, and that's why we want to pay attention to it.
Well, and it's a grain based hay. It's not a grass, really. It's a grain type of a hybrid. Rye
Maybe
with
use that
or
on the
with
5 to
wheat.
6 years you're gonna finish.
Oh, they're going to get that. Absolutely, they're going
Yeah.
to get that. Is if it's good quality. Again, we may not even buy it. We'll
Yeah.
have to see. It's got to be good hay
Right.
and usable. So yeah, that's exactly what'll happen to it. You'll take some of those hays and you feed them out that higher quality stuff, the ones you're feeding for people to stick down their gulliga zipper and say, "Ooh, that's some tasty tender meat from the
T-bone
Hashknife Ranch, ribeye."
or sirloin, I think is what Greg said at one
Yeah,
point.
that's right. Naming
All
these
right.
steers.
With that, I hope everybody enjoyed learning little bit about RFV and RFQ with us. I did say it right. That's good.
Yeah.
And seeing how my brain bucket works, because you clearly saw me having to process through some things, but I hope it wasn't too painful. So with that, I'll give the last comments today.
Well, and this is one of those times that if you've got some good quality hay at a decent price, we'd pay you for it. Otherwise, we just thank you till you're better paid.